I talk to a lot of people about Metroidvania games because I love hearing opinions. I especially like opinions I disagree with. Taking the time to understand viewpoints that I can't immediately comprehend has made me see aspects to games that I wouldn't have otherwise noticed. This is a process that has brought me a lot of joy and enlightenment. However, there are still a few things that people say that can twist my spine a bit. One of those things is, the 2D Metroid games have no story. When I hear this, I usually just bite my tongue. But my tongue can't handle being chewed on forever, so I think it's time I talk about it. In my opinion, not only does Metroid have a great story, it sets a standard for how video game stories can be told. Later Metroid games also set a standard for how video game stories shouldn't be told, but we're not going to cover that in this video. Today, I'm going to focus on the original Metroid trilogy, stopping with Super Metroid. Maybe at a later date I'll talk some more on Metroid Fusion, Metroid Dread, and yes, Metroid Other M. I won't be talking too much about the remakes for the first two games this time around, because that's a whole other tangent. But I might be referencing other games in the series to support my analysis. I should also note that this analysis is strictly my interpretation of the Metroid story without using the manga or other external sources. Those sources may create a different view of what story is being told, and I think that's okay. A story, after all, is what the listener takes from it, and no matter what was intended by the author, it doesn't make other interpretations invalid. In fact, I think understanding this point is important enough that I'm going to include a breakdown of what a video game narrative is to me, and this will set the groundwork for any story analysis videos I might do in the future. If you just want to skip ahead to the meat of the analysis, feel free to use any of the timestamps I've included in the video description. I do have to add a spoiler warning. I plan on going into meticulous detail on the endings of all of the first 3 Metroid games, so if you haven't played them and want to experience them yourself, then stop this video once I start talking about those Metroid games. I'll give another spoiler warning before I start. So let's talk about what makes up a video game's narrative. I like to break the narrative down into 4 parts: theming, ludonarrative, plot, and story. First, let's talk about theming. When we look at a canvas, what we see is the paint on top of it, and it's that paint that gives meaning to the piece as a whole. Theming is basically the paint we put over a game's set of mechanics. Let's use the board game Talisman as an example. It's a game where you roll the dice and move around the board and a ton of random things happen. Strip away the theming and a card might say, roll a 1 and you lose 3 turns, roll a 2 or 3 and nothing happens, or roll a 5 or 6 and one of the other players loses 3 turns. For the purposes of being a game, that's the only critical information we need. But Talisman takes it a step further and creates a narrative to go along with those mechanics. The card I'm using in this example is called Toadify, which is a spell you can cast on another player or creature. When you cast the spell, you roll the dice, and if you roll a 1, the spell backfires, and you're turned into a toad instead of your opponent. A 2 or 3 means the spell fizzles, and if you roll a 5 or 6, the player you cast it on is turned into a toad, which basically makes them useless for 3 turns. Without this kind of theming, Talisman would be a rather tedious set of mundane tasks tied to pure RNG, and no one would enjoy that. The fun from Talisman is the theme-based narrative you create with your friends, and you can laugh about the implications of what happens to each of you as you fill in the gaps of that narrative together. Applying the concept of theming to an action game, you can make something that qualifies as a game just by creating some boxes that shoot at each other. But if you put that theming paint over it, then you get to enjoy being the legendary bounty hunter Samus and take part in a galactic quest. For the development of most games, the concept of theming comes first and the mechanics are created to fit that theming, but that doesn't mean that the coat of paint can't be changed. Famous examples of this happening are Puyo Puyo becoming Dr. Robotnik's Beam Machine, or Doki Doki Panic becoming a Super Mario game. You can also create a perfectly fine game without putting too much thought into the theming, but this can create a product that feels inferior. Ceave Gaming has a great video entitled Nintendo's Obsession with Gameplay is Dumb, and that goes deep into a great example of why theming is important, and I recommend watching that if you want some more insight into the subject. Theming is a strong narrative tool that seems like it's only surface level at a glance, but it can serve a critical role in enhancing a game's story. After all, the box that hunts other boxes isn't as catchy as Samus, the legendary bounty hunter. Ludonarrative is closely connected to theming, but it's sort of the other side of its coin. Ludonarrative is literally defined as where the gameplay elements and narrative elements meet. Practically speaking, this just means that ludonarrative is the story that is being told by what you do. Where you've probably heard this word the most is in connection to the phrase ludonarrative dissonance, which is basically when the game's overt storytelling elements, such as the theming or cutscenes, are saying you're doing one thing, when in actuality you're doing something that conflicts with that idea. Like for instance, let's say you're playing a Batman game, where they're using that Batman mythology that the titular protagonist never kills anyone, and yet you spend the entire game beating the snot out of bad guys and running them over with your car. That's basically ludonarrative dissonance in a nutshell. Ludonarrative dissonance isn't something I run into too often while playing Metroidvania games, although I do occasionally run into what I've started calling ludonarrative nonsense, which is when the game has you doing something that isn't backed up by any narrative explanation. In Metroid, for instance, you can't access Turian until you defeat Kraid and Ridley. Why would anybody set up their security system this way? When they do it again in Super Metroid, it's almost like their souls are what keep the, I don't know, C4 charged statues from blowing up the entrance to Turian? Either the pirates are just idiots or they have some unsupported extreme hubris going on when they think no one is going to be able to kill all of their strongest leaders, so they think there's no way anyone's going to ever be able to pick that lock. I don't know, maybe it's a failsafe in case the pirate boss can't be around to provide their retinal scan. Stuff like this is very gamey, which can be immersion breaking if you obsess over it too much, but personally I find it to be pretty harmless most of the time. Where ludonarrative can get really interesting is when the game assigns meaning to an action you can perform, and then uses that meaning to reinforce its narrative later on. This is especially poignant when the action is subverted in some way, although most examples I could give would enter spoiler territory I don't want to tread on today. While it could be argued that the idea of theming could be applied to other mediums, ludonarrative is something completely unique to video games. Thus, I think it's something that should always be considered when doing an analysis of a video game story. The plot of a game is the same concept as plot in any other medium. I like to think of plot as the facts, events that happen and the sequence in which they happen. Samus goes to SR388 and murders a bunch of Metroids would be a brief summary of what happens in Metroid 2. Mario goes to save the princess from Bowser is the plot of many Mario games, and teenagers level up and fight God is the plot of way too many JRPGs. Plot is often confused with story, when in my opinion there is a clear separation there. The lessons we can draw from a narrative are usually related to the consequences of a plot, but they aren't always logically correlated. For instance, two characters could go on similar adventures with similar plots, but draw completely different conclusions, with one finding hope in the adversity, and the other being buried under their regrets. Thus, story is the lessons learned from the narrative, or the conclusions that can be drawn from it. This could be the release obtained by the characters, which is the idea that YouTuber Just Right has a great video on, where he talks about the plot and story of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, link below. But it can also be the lessons we apply to ourselves, or at the very least the meaning we can draw from the work. Watching characters you relate to finally achieve something that they've worked so hard for could be cathartic. Watching yourself achieve something that you've worked so hard for could be the entire narrative of a difficult game. This separation of plot and story can sometimes create confusion. Sometimes viewers, or players, can make an assumption that the plot is the story, or with video games, that the only story available is what is fed to them textually, either through the cutscenes or via lore bits scattered throughout the world. You can also enjoy a game simply for its mechanics, which is fine, I do this all the time. But by doing so you could completely miss a story that could also be very meaningful to you. You could also be saving yourself some time. It depends on the game. When people say that 2D Metroid has no story, I think it's partially because Metroid can be enjoyed while ignoring its story altogether, which is in contrast to a game that forces you to either acknowledge its story or just turn it off. I'm not saying anyone is wrong for enjoying Metroid strictly for the gameplay, but I absolutely enjoy it for the narrative as well. The separation of plot and story is also important when you take metaphor into consideration. You might be playing as a dapper dude with time reversal powers, but everything you're doing could actually be a representation of the conflicted feelings that might come from inventing a weapon of mass destruction. Some games might be politically charged, asking the player uncomfortable questions about very real problems. Other games could haphazardly create valid interpretations that have hilariously horrifying implications. Just about every game has a story, whether it was intended by the creator or not. And the Metroid Trilogy has a story, so without further ado, this is my analysis of what that story is. As mentioned previously, I'm going to be spoiling everything about these games, so if you still want to obtain your own interpretation of this story unanchored by my opinion, now is the time to jump ship. The plot of the original Metroid, according to the US North English Manual, is that the Galactic Space Police were having issues with space pirates attacking everything, and those pirates really crossed the line when they stole a capsule that contained a sample organism from planet SR388. They named the organism Metroid. And one of the things that made this creature special is that when you exposed it to beta radiation, it multiplied rapidly. The creature was also very powerful, capable of sucking the energy and life force out of any living thing. It was theorized that the Metroids caused the destruction of the civilization that used to live on SR388, and the Federation judged that it was far too dangerous to leave in the hands of the space pirates. If they managed to figure out the secret of the Metroid, it could mean the destruction of the entire galaxy. The Federation tracked the pirates down to their last base located on planet Ceave, and launched a full-scale attack on them. Their defenses, however, were very strong, and the Federation was unable to secure the planet. Meanwhile, in a room hidden deep within the center of the fortress, the preparations for multiplying the Metroid was progressing slowly. So, as a last resort, the Federation turned to bounty hunters, deciding at this point that it would be best to send a specialist into the center of the base to destroy Mother Brain. Enter Samus Aran, who according to the manual it says, he is the greatest of all space hunters, and has successfully completed numerous missions that everybody thought were impossible. The manual talks about how he has superpowers thanks to being surgically strengthened with robotics. Concerning his identity, most importantly it says, his true form is shrouded in mystery. Samus sets out into the depths of planet Ceave, a natural fortress, to defeat Ridley and Kraid, and ultimately face off with Mother Brain. The manual also gives a lot of helpful details about the enemies you'll face, but most of them to me are less to do with the narrative and more to do with the strategies that will help you play. In fact, the manual sort of includes a mini walkthrough, including a map, so anyone that thinks this game is completely obtuse and doesn't want to just look up a guide online should definitely check out the manual. The manual is also the only source of information we get at this point on the identity of who or what Mother Brain is. And unfortunately, the best description the manual gives us is that she is the bad guy at the end of the game. There are some environmental storytelling clues for things expounded on in later games though, so let's dive into the game proper. The original Metroid might be the scariest game in the 2D series, at least as far as the gameplay is concerned. Enemies can deplete your health bar rapidly, and if you die, you only respawn with 30 HP, forcing you to choose between grinding your way back to the top, finding a blessed E-tank which fills you to full, or to tiptoe through the environment, hoping nothing nicks you along the way. The Metroids themselves are the most dangerous that they'll ever be. You can't duck and shoot, or shoot diagonally, so you really have to watch their position relative to yours, because once they get attached to you, they're a major pain to get off. Even if you survive the attack, you'll really wish you had that HP for the upcoming fight. Metroid 1 is also the most gamey of the series, with plenty of glitches or quirks to exploit, which is especially relevant when you fight Ridley and Kraid. It makes their manual designation of being mini-bosses all that more insulting to them. Even with the limitations of the NES, they were already playing with the atmospheric elements that would later become a staple of the series. The iconic Brainstar music is positive and brimming with heroism. But dive deeper into Ridley and Kraid's lair, and things get a lot more sinister. The entrance of each lair also includes a facsimile of each boss's face, a foreboding reminder of the deadly, or laughable, foe that lies within. What Metroid does here with its atmosphere isn't particularly unique even for its time. Its more popular sister series, The Legend of Zelda, did similar things with its atmosphere. In Zelda, dungeons play a mysterious tune, drumming up the sense that your adventure just got more serious. And when you get close to the boss rooms, you can hear their gasps through the walls. Metroid 1 is thus very similar to Zelda, both in terms of atmosphere and story. Both games are about a famous hero who goes to stop some monsters from doing monstrous things, and both games seem to stray very little from those tropes. Even with this first Metroid game, though, there was an attempt to subvert those expectations. Turian, compared to the mini-boss layers, is strangely sterile and mechanical. It gives clues to what Mother Brain would eventually become in canon, if the evidence isn't already there. Mother Brain is powered by pylons that you must destroy before you can even reach her, and she is in no doubt linked to the secret of controlling the Metroids. Therefore, even though you've eradicated the Metroids leading up to Mother Brain, her existence still poses a threat to the galaxy. While tactics similar to what could be used against Ridley and Kraid can make the encounter much easier, Mother Brain is still the most formidable foe in the game. Samus shatters the brain's glass tube and destroys its flesh, which triggers the base's self-destruct system. After a final escape sequence, your quest is over. But if you played well enough, you'll make a shocking discovery. The manual lied. As it turns out, Samus's true form is a woman. Overall, as a narrative, the original Metroid is fine as a starting point for additional stories, as we soon shall see. It wasn't that much different than its contemporaries, and at least from most interpretations I can come up with, there isn't anything particularly profound to be said about this game. Ludonarratively, it's the best game at conveying how dangerous the Metroids can be, because this is really the only time where the facehugger versions of the Metroids are an actual threat. In future installments, they act as sort of a formality. They still have that one major weakness, that as soon as you get them cold, they can't move at all. And funny enough, this apparently leads the Federation to equipping their soldiers with ice beams as a standard in Metroid Other M.
Listen up! Freeze guns authorized!
I'm sure that the Metroids would decimate a civilian population, but this kind of weakness makes them seem kind of tame compared to the pirates themselves. But of course, you never really have to face them in the swarms that the Federation fears the most. Putting establishing lore and setting aside, the original Metroid still has that one subversion of expectation that could possibly have had some meta-societal effects, because I remember clearly it being a big buzz around the playground as a child to suddenly find out that the main protagonist of a video game is a girl, especially in a game where that role is typically filled by a male. I'm not going to go into the discussion that has evolved around Samus on that subject since then, but I think it's worth pointing out that this incidental detail had made a splash. Regardless of whatever the intent the authors had of making Samus a woman, this final scene was our first view of who Samus might be as a character, and that would only be expanded upon further as the series progressed. I already jokingly summarized Metroid 2 when I talked about plot, but let's grab some details from the manual anyway. The manual starts off by providing a complete synopsis of what happened in the first game. The Federation, after serious consideration of how terrible and destructive the Metroid lifeform was, sent a research team to confirm that there weren't any more Metroids left on SR-388. But that research team sent a distress signal and could not be found. They sent a rescue team, and it was also lost. Finally, they assembled a combat team, which reported back that they had landed, but after that, they were never heard from again. The Federation was convinced that the Metroid was still on the planet, and fears of the Metroid threat spread across the galaxy. They believed that only one Metroid could potentially wipe out an entire planetary civilization, so they convened to decide what to do. Samus dealt with the Metroids once before, so they gave her the order to go to SR-388 and exterminate whatever Metroids she found there. There's actually a good amount to unpack from this manual plot alone. At this point in the Metroid story, it's very clear that the number of appearances the Metroid have made throughout the galaxy has been very small. The creatures were viewed as destructive monsters, and fears and rumors could have created political pressures coming from the civilian populations. There are a lot of good words to suggest that the moral quandary of xenocide was actually carefully considered by the Federation before sending Samus. It also reveals how little the Federation actually knows about the Metroids. The research team that they first sent, notably not a group prepared to destroy Metroids, was lost, and the second team was also apparently not a trained team of combat soldiers either. The Federation wanted to learn more about the Metroids, and the conclusion to exterminate them was very apparently not an easy one until after the combat team also disappeared. The narrative from the manual also establishes just how powerful Samus is, and how strong the Federation views her as. They trusted her to do a job that they had originally sent an entire trained team to do. That's great confidence that the Federation has in her, but that kind of mission still is a scary prospect for any individual person. Thus, it isn't a stretch to say that Metroid 2 is kind of a horror game, at least with as much horror as a game intended for young audiences can have. Metroid 2 is all about the atmosphere. Most of the game is played with no music at all, just the sounds of the environment around you, or the clicks of Samus's feet hitting the ground. Where the game has music, it shoots for a very specific mood. At the beginning of the game, a somewhat heroic tune plays similar to the Brinstar music. It kind of sounds like this is just another day at work for Samus, but then you meet your first Metroid. The The very first one you see bursts out of its shell, revealing that in Metroid 1, you've only witnessed just one of the forms a Metroid can take. And spoiler alert, this Alpha Metroid is not the end of what you will see. The juxtaposition of what I'm going to lovingly call the jump scare theme really sets the stage for what you might expect for the rest of the game. The hero's theme still plays when you traverse the main hallway leading to other Metroid layers, but things get quiet when you get deeper into the caves. The only other time you hear music before the final Metroid layer is in the ancient buildings of the Chozo civilization that used to live here. It's not my favorite track in the game, but it does provide a sense that you're somewhere that was artificially constructed, instead of just being inside a cave. So why do I say that these buildings belong to the Chozo at this point? Well, because you find Chozo statues in the ruins. As far as I know, they weren't officially called Chozo until the Super Metroid manual gives them that designation. But the statues do look very similar to the statues seen in Metroid 1. In fact, the room structures are almost identical. So especially with later games confirming these suspicions, it's safe to say that the ancient civilization found on Ceave is also the same civilization that disappeared from planet SR388. Now, it wasn't uncommon for games in the early 90s to simply be soft reboots of the previous games in the series, with a graphical upgrade, or a side grade for the handheld versions. So as a player back then, it might not be something you would have noticed. Soft rebooting or calling back to previous games in the series may have been the original intent. But thanks to this environmental cue, the Chozo are now inseparably linked to the Metroid, since their fingerprints are all over the Metroid homeworld. Going back to the subject of atmosphere, it's hard for me to really sell how well Metroid 2 accomplishes the scary mood when showing you screens from this MGBA emulator that I'm using to record this footage. Metroid 2 was originally a Game Boy game, and the screen it was played on was not only monochromatic, but also lacked any backlighting. For most games, this design was terrible, even if it was a technical limitation at the time the Game Boy was released. For Metroid 2, however, it was a feature. This is the original Game Boy I played Metroid 2 on when I was a kid. When you played this game in your room, at night, before you went to bed, with your headphones on and the sound turned up, you necessarily had to have some other light source to even be able to see the screen. Shining a flashlight onto that green dot matrix mess became something akin to shining a light into the caves you were exploring. Thus, the limitations of the Game Boy itself became part of Metroid 2's theming. I'm not going to tell you that you can't get the true experience of Metroid 2 without getting a hold of one of these ancient gray bricks, but it's a circumstance that you might consider if you're going to play this game, no matter what platform you play it on. Even though you have a very gamey score counter on the bottom of the screen, telling you how many Metroids there are left for you to destroy, the way Metroid 2 is designed was meant to inspire dread. Walking through the dark corridors, you'll find shells of adolescent Metroids, indicating that one of those bigger, more aged Metroids must be nearby. But even with that telegraph, if you're not treading carefully, that lovely jump scare music might catch you off guard. Good thing those old bricks were almost indestructible. As you progress through the game, you find bigger and meaner Metroids, and with each discovery of a new form, they're depicted as being even more grotesque and ludonarratively a heck of a lot more dangerous. Unless you know about their weak points, each one takes more missiles to kill than the last, and managing that ammo supply can be especially hard since the places that Metroids actually live don't usually provide an easy means to resupply. You could say that the game is split into phases, exploring Chozo ruins for upgrades, and then traversing Metroid nests to kill what's inside. In fact, something I didn't even notice until I was writing about this dichotomy was that in the first area you visit, there are no Metroids in the Chozo ruins. In the second area, however, there are a few of those Alpha Metroids. In the third Chozo ruins, you find the meaner Gamma Metroids encroaching the hallways. Eventually you'll discover the fourth Chozo ruin, which happens to be a lofty skyscraper full of the Chozo's strongest weapon technology. And it's there that you may discover your first Zeta Metroid, which is a fire-breathing tank, taking a huge 20 missiles to take down. In a sense, the order of these areas, and the way they are populated with Metroids, tells the story of the downfall of the Chozo civilization that lived here, confirming the suspicions of the Federation. Having one of the strongest Metroid forms show up in what could be the Chozo's greatest monument of industry and success indicates just how powerful these creatures are. These Metroids are unequivocally being depicted as monsters. The revelation of the final Metroid form, the Omega Metroid, is done in an area with an intentionally confusing wraparound, subverting player expectations built up over the course of the game. It's a clever moment that reinforces to me just how ahead of its time Metroid 2 was, and narratively it further progresses the idea that these creatures are incomprehensible and alien, as sprinkling a little confusion into your game has the power to do. The second to last area of the game has 3 more Omega Metroids for you to kill, and their lair is completely stripped of any life forms or even plant matter that you have been seeing in other areas up to that point. It elicits the idea that this area has been desolated, and only one culprit for the deed has been provided. Climb further up the passageway, and you'll find one more final Chozo ruin. Here the walls are scratched and worn. You'll also notice test tubes, suggesting that this was a place of experimentation. There's one more Chozo statue here, but it's been destroyed. The prize that it offers is the Ice Beam. Remember that Metroid weakness to cold that I had mentioned earlier? Well, apparently the Metroids were aware of it, and weren't happy about the Ice Beam's creation. With only one Metroid left to kill, you make your way into the ancient Chozo lab. But it is not the end, and more Metroids are born just as you are at the cusp of accomplishing your goal. Suddenly, you're back in Turian from the first game, freezing and fighting adolescent Metroids in laboratory hallways, and the parallels between those two areas may be closer than you realize. Were the Chozo attempting to do exactly what the pirates were trying to accomplish with Mother Brain? Or how about a more interesting question? Did the Chozo create the Metroids in this lab? In any case, at the end of Turian you met Mother Brain. What does a natural Mother Metroid look like? This fight with the Metroid Queen was a turning point in how I approach video games in general. It was so hard for my little child brain to figure out. It's easily the hardest thing I had played up to that point. Knowing how to defeat it now kinda makes it a joke, but for a non-veteran player, if there was any ludonarrative indicator of how dangerous the Metroids could truly be, this Queen was the most drastic. It can take over 200 missiles if you fire only at her armored carapace, but you do have the option of trading health for a significant increase in damage by destroying her from the inside. After a potentially long fight, when she finally dies, the music simply goes silent. When you defeated Mother Brain at the end of Turian, a self-destruct sequence was activated, and bombastic music started playing, indicating you needed to escape for your life. In Metroid 2, however, The credits music is still triumphant. Samus accomplished her goal. But the quiet contrast between Metroid 1's ending and Metroid 2's ending is telling. Something more significant happened here, and even when I played this as a child, the experience was evocative. When I wasn't trying to speedrun the game, I would sometimes just replay the Metroid Queen fight again and play out this ending. It's emotionally cathartic, but what does it mean? Why would Samus explicitly fail her mission on purpose? Was it because the infant Metroid posed no threat to her? Did she pragmatically recognize the potential the Metroid could have if researchers were able to spend some time with it? Did the Federation give her some kind of additional mission directive, that she could salvage anything their researchers were unable to claim earlier, that she should? Or maybe it's because Samus is showing mercy. I especially like the Super Metroid recap of this scene, where they show Samus pointing her gun at the Metroid. For just a moment, she thought about killing it, but hesitated. This tells us a lot about Samus's character without saying a word. Maybe, in her life of violence, she too had an experience where an innocent child's parents were killed. Maybe she realizes that this whole Metroid thing, the threat that they pose to the galaxy, wasn't actually the fault of the Metroids themselves. They are an innocent party, simply living their lives on a planet where apparently they did a pretty good job defending themselves anyway. They may have destroyed the Chozo civilization there, but does that mean they no longer have a right to exist as a species? Samus had almost completely committed genocide, and if the Ice Beam Chozo statue was any indication, what she had just killed was possibly more intelligent than anyone could have assumed. I'm not saying that Samus should feel guilt for what she had just done, but maybe, just maybe, she did. But the credits are a triumph. As it should be, Samus had just accomplished her most difficult mission of all. She did what armies of Federation soldiers could not, and thanks to her efforts,
the last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
I will still maintain that Super Metroid has one of the greatest hooks of any game that came before it, and is still exemplary even today. A single spoken line, with a voice being a rare thing for the Super Nintendo, tells us everything we need to know. In the Metroid universe, the Metroid is linked to the peace of the entire galaxy. There's no need to draw from the manual this time around. Super Metroid is finally self-contained within the game itself. The story for Metroid 3 starts off when Samus delivers the Metroid to some scientists at a research station. She apparently sticks around long enough for them to make some discoveries, because she excitedly exclaims that they discovered that the powers of the Metroid might be harnessed for the good of civilization. Samus stays long enough to feel satisfied everything is going to be fine, and leaves the station to look for more work. But she had barely left before she caught a distress signal coming from the station. Like a ghost from Samus's past, Ridley is still alive. More importantly, he has the Metroid, and Samus is unable to defeat him before he escapes. There is just a bit of gaminess here that you either have to ignore or explain away. Samus just got done killing a Queen Metroid after defeating 4 Omega Metroids, all 5 of which are considered final boss material in other Metroid games. If Samus hadn't for some reason traded her arsenal of missiles away, this might have been a completely different fight. But then again, Super Metroid gives Ridley a handsome power-up compared to the first game, so that even with 200 missiles, success wouldn't necessarily be a guarantee. There could be a narrative reason for why Ridley even attempts to fight Samus at all, since it would make more sense for him to just fly away as soon as they meet each other. In fact, it's almost like Ridley is waiting there for her, challenging her, luring her to Ceave's so that he can have another fight with her. It's actually a huge risk that he does fight her, because if you deal enough damage to Ridley, he actually drops the Metroid. I am using cheats to accomplish this, but then he picks it up again and flees. He didn't need to be there, so clearly he's there for a reason. This is really where the popular series rivalry between Ridley and Samus starts, and the fact that Ridley spends any time attacking Samus at all goes to show how much he detests her. Ridley's flight damages the Ceres station beyond repair, and the self-destruct system activates to destroy what's left, a system no doubt meant to protect the galaxy from the Metroid that would otherwise be researched there. Samus pursues Ridley and ends up on Ceave again, the same planet from the original Metroid. The planet's surface is quiet, and dust and steam emanates from its scorched stones. Go a little deeper, and you'll find yourself in a familiar shaft. One step to the right, and you'll see the shattered casing that once housed Mother Brain, with the shattered pylons lining the rest of the room. The door to the right doesn't lead to Turian, though, but rather to an elevator that has been repurposed to take you back to the place where it all began, complete with a morph ball sitting exactly where you found it originally. There's an obvious attempt here to evoke nostalgia for the first game, but it also serves as a strong reminder that these are the same forces that Samus faced before. This could be an allegory of general repeated history, as much as it is a literal repeated history. With 2 of the power-ups that Samus collects, it becomes obvious that Samus is being watched. After getting these power-ups, going back through Mother Brain's old computer room, you discover swarms of pirates ready to stop you. And suddenly the rest of the planet is alive again, and everything wants to kill you. Like Metroid 2, Super Metroid is also all about the atmosphere. Unlike Metroid 2 though, you don't know exactly what you're looking for, and that Metroidvania gameplay that this game immortalized becomes a well-placed ludonarrative. Your goal is to rescue the stolen Metroid, but you need to break past all the roadblocks placed in your path to get there. The activity of search action is almost like detective work. One ability upgrade leads to the next, and the game unfolds gradually, like clues all coming together until you see the big picture. The Metroidvania staple of recontextualizing old areas with new powers and ideas serves as a metaphor for this. It also gives the game the opportunity to tell several other mini-stories, like those proto-Metroid creatures you find in Meridia. Perhaps the pirates were attempting to recreate the power they lusted for from the creatures Samus had eradicated, or maybe they were an early attempt at cloning Metroids in the short time they had after Ridley stole the Metroid, and while Samus was delayed in her search. One of my favorite mini-stories included in Super Metroid is the crashed ship where you fight Phantoon. This one location is rife with details that can feed into all kinds of fan theories. It's not just the beginning of the game that you find a few nods to the original Metroid. Kraid and Ridley being here at all serves that purpose. I especially like the mini Kraid you'll find in the linear chamber leading up to his fight. This is kind of a bait and switch that I'm sure only a fraction of Super Metroid's audience could even notice. The original Metroid also included a fake Kraid, but he was the same size as the actual Kraid you needed to kill. Showing a smaller Kraid, and then showing a much larger and more intimidating Kraid is supposed to be one of those subversions of expectation that we saw in Metroid 2 with the first Omega Metroid. However, since the Metroid Zero Mission remake of the original just has Big Kraid, this juxtaposition is forever lost to anyone that replaces the NES title with the remake. Both Ridley and Kraid have their faces adorning their layers again though, and like everything else in this game, there's an added sense of the tenacity that these pirates have to accomplish their wicked goals. If Ridley was actually challenging Samus at the beginning of the game, he sure wasn't interested in making it easy for her to arrive at the designated rematch. Ridley's lair this time around is completely submerged in lava, which takes exploring most of Ceave before you can safely access it. I mean, normally that is. In the hallway leading up to Ridley's chamber is a pair of elite pirates that may be more difficult to defeat than Ridley himself. Ridley is either toying with Samus at this point, or perhaps the goal all along was to finish her off. She is, after all, the only person in the entire galaxy who is strong enough to defeat a Metroid Queen and nearly eradicate the entire species. She is the one individual standing between them and ruling the galaxy. If that final battle with Ridley wasn't a grudge match from the first game, it was at least a death match with the fate of the galaxy itself as its prize. Defeat Ridley, and you'll finally find the container that held the stolen Metroid. It's broken and shattered on the ground. Turian 2 had been constructed and locked up just like it was before. Defeat the 4 required bosses, and Samus again finds herself traversing another laboratory hallway, defending herself with beams of frost and concussive missiles against those adolescent Metroids. Make your way far enough, and you'll find the grayed out remains of creatures you've met before. which crumble to dust as you go near. An ephemeral display of the Metroid's dreadful power. Deeper into Turian, Samus presses on until she meets a familiar face. With Samus having only a shred of health left, the rescued Metroid stops its voracious attack. It remembers Samus, maybe not recognizing that she is the force that ensured that it was the only Metroid left remaining, even just now as Samus tore through Turian-style hallways for the third time in a row. Do the Metroids imprint like some creatures do, and this infant Metroid thinks that Samus is its mother? Maybe its intelligence goes beyond that instinct, and the creature resonates with the act of mercy shown to it. Regardless, it leaves Samus alive and floats away cooing, maybe in contemplation, or maybe like a confused dog. Samus picks herself back up again and finds Mother Brain's chamber. The battle starts off exactly as it did before, with the brain case broken and the flesh battered by Samus's newly upgraded arsenal. The brain turns gray and explodes. But this time, no self-destruct system is activated. Like Ridley and Kraid, Mother Brain has gotten stronger. Once you deal enough damage to Mother Brain, a scripted event plays out. Samus is decimated by Mother Brain's new powers. Samus is brought to her knees. It looks like it's the end for the galaxy's greatest bounty hunter. Whether that young Metroid thought that Samus was its mother, or if it had a life debt, it had just sacrificed its life to protect hers. More than that, though, this creature that the galaxy had so fully feared, a creature capable of reducing living things to dust. From a species so monstrous, it was responsible for the downfall of an entire planet's civilization. This creature had just demonstrated a healing power at least equal to its destructive capability, regardless of whether that power was coming from what was drained from Mother Brain or not. That the Metroids could be used for the good of civilization may have been an understatement. Conversely, those that lust after this power cared nothing about the lives it must exploit to get a hold of it. The galaxy feared the Metroid, but the Metroid was merely something they didn't, or maybe even couldn't, understand. The fear actually comes from the pirates, or anyone else that seeks to exercise control over others, to bind them up according to their whims. They can take the power to heal, and turn it into a corrupting force, leaving nothing but dust in its wake. The problem was never the Metroids, but rather those individuals willing to commit these kinds of acts. There's a word for people like that. Evil. What makes a story great to me is the depth of discussion that can come from it, and I hope that with my little summary of these 3 games, I've inspired some to think a little bit more outside of the textual plot. Even with an understanding of the concept of metaphor, I don't think there's necessarily a singular meaning that can be drawn from all of this, or rather I think that any attempt to assert that there's exactly one meaning to Super Metroid would be disingenuous. One interpretation that immediately came up when I was describing my script to a friend was he jokingly told me, "Metroids don't kill people, pirates do." And I'm sure that there are some of you listening that got that same vibe. For those that may not be familiar, this is a play on the gun rights activist mantra, guns don't kill people, people do. And while I think there's a principle there that can either be useful or dismissive depending on what you're arguing about, I also don't think that phrase is a perfect analogy to the story I've just outlined. After all, last I checked, your guns don't imprint on you, think you're their mother, and shoot anyone that tries to kill you all by themselves. One interpretation I like a little more is that Metroids are an allegory for nuclear power. This series originally came out right at the end of the Cold War, and during an era that the cultural effects of the nuclear bomb were still fully in force, especially in Japan where this game was originally written. It was a popular subject to allude to. I mean, video game writers were creating stories about nuclear fears even heading into the late 90s on both sides of the ocean.
Metal Gear. It can't be.
You knew?
Rewriting Samus as the hopes of humanity, witnessing the evils of nuclear power, recognizing that there are good things that can come from it, but then reinforcing a warning that history has a tendency to repeat itself is possibly much closer to what might have been influencing or inspiring the authors. I put forth the Metroid trait of multiplying rapidly when being exposed to radiation as evidence of this interpretation. The magical effects of radiation are a classic piece of nuclear fiction, after all. I could go on with this analogy and make it my entire thesis, but I personally think the most useful interpretations of any story are the interpretations we can apply to ourselves. How often have we feared something that we don't understand? Have you ever stopped to consider your actions? And have you ever reversed course when you realize you might have been going down a more wicked path, even after you've nearly completed that path? How often do we use those around us for our own gain, without even stopping to consider who they are or what their troubles might be? Do we ever categorize people as a group, creating prejudices that blind us to the outliers of our assumptions? This is the mark of a great science fiction to me, where the fantasy elements draw uncomfortably close to our own reality. Super Metroid is a masterpiece, and it was built off of 2 previous games that only enhance how great it can be. Being almost 30 years old, people have torn this game inside out and upside down. It's possible to defeat the bosses in reverse order, or to make the game bend to your whims. But to me, none of that gaminess detracts from the core messages I can draw from it, and for that reason, I think its story is great. Something that surprised me years later was that Super Metroid includes a bonus in its ending that I had never discovered. Throughout the course of the game, you meet several animals that teach you hidden techniques that you can use in your quest. And as it turns out, when you set the time bomb to destroy Ceave, they end up trapped in a room near where your ship has landed. If you take a little time during your escape, you can rescue them. And as you fly away, you can see their ship as a tiny shooting star moving away from the planet. It's a really cool detail that continues to reward players who are especially observant. What makes this detail still more interesting today is in the speedrun community, particularly in the festivals like Games Done Quick. In these contests, the most prestigious professional players are invited to perform their accomplishments in front of an audience, shooting for the fastest time possible live for all to see. The exciting nature of these contests is that you'll never know if you might witness a new world record as it happens. Maybe because of this desire to witness history, anytime Super Metroid is run, there's always an argument about whether saving the animals is worthwhile. Do you go for the best speedrun time possible, or do you make the sacrifice and take the extra time to commit the act of mercy? Awesome Games Done Quick is one of the more prominent speedrun charity events, and they even turned this age-old argument into a bid for charitable cash.
We will get to it, but apparently someone donated $10,000 right at the end.
Wow. Like I said. And yeah, now we have to save the animals, I guess, which is not normally part of the run. But
in 2017, almost $800,000 were raised, with Save the Animals and Kill the Animals sitting neck to neck, according to the Games Done Quick bid tracker. Even 23 years after Super Metroid's release, we have gaming philosophers debating on one of mankind's greatest quandaries. Are we pragmatic and focus on the self-progressive goals we have set for ourselves, or do we save a few pixels with faces on them, just because it makes us feel more emotionally satisfied? Well, in Metroid 4, also known as Metroid Fusion, these animals are alive and are a critical part of the story, so saving the animals has to be the canon ending. You might say that by not saving the animals, you really aren't beating Super Metroid at all. You monsters. But regardless of what side you're on with this argument, it's a fun and interesting debate. The story of Save the Animals and the effect it's had on this player base was most likely not intended.
yeah, even with saving the animals, that was a very good time.
But it exists nevertheless. This is one of the most beautiful parts of video games as a storytelling medium, that we ourselves are part of that very story. Super Metroid may come off as simplistic, looking only at its textual plot, but for many it's so much more than that, and I hope that at least a little bit, I was able to show why. Thank you for watching our little analysis. Comment below with any of your own interpretations of the Metroid Trilogy story. Tell us about your favorite aspects of these 3 games. If you enjoyed this video, please share it with your friends and consider subscribing, as it really helps us keep this channel going. We are of course called the Metroidvania Review for a reason, and that's because our purpose is to hunt down and report on worthwhile Metroidvania games to play. Most of our reviews are in written format, and you can find over 150 written reviews over on our website, with a new review coming out every Monday. There are also, of course, video reviews on this very channel that I encourage you to check out if you're interested. In the next few weeks, we'll be doing a video review of Metroid Dread that we'll have up as soon as we're satisfied with it. I hope that you're able to check it out when it releases. I want to thank you again for watching, and I hope you have an especially adventurous day.